Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. Nature and the Nation explores the intersection of national conservatism and philosophical naturalism. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore philosophy, psychology, history, politics, and sociology through the lens of this exploration, with a particular focus on existentialism, evolutionary psychology, ancient Greece, the American Old Right, and the European New Right. For today's show, I will be looking at The Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. This book was written in 1887, so it's one of his last books, but his thought process, his philosophy had really come together by that point. So this is in some ways sort of a summation of some of his ideas. And there's a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche material that I'm very interested in, but one of the things that I'm most interested in is the concept of the master and slave morality. And that's what he talks about in this book. He also talks about it in Beyond Good and Evil. This book actually came out after Beyond Good and Evil, and it seems to sort of dilute it down to the essence of the argument. He talks about a number of different aspects of morality. He talks in here a little bit about punishment and the history of punishment. I don't really want to get into that. That's not all that particularly interesting to me at this point. What I was most interested in was to look and see how perhaps the master morality might correspond with what we had saw last episode in the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Because Nietzsche presents the master morality as sort of this ancient moral code that was disrupted or upended by a new moral code that came about with most particularly with the rise of Christianity in the West. That Christianity carried with it a slave morality, and the old pre-Christian pagans had a sort of master morality. That's kind of the crux of his argument. Now, Aristotle wrote long before the rise of Christianity, so we can ask ourselves, does Aristotle's moral system correspond in any way to Nietzsche's master morality? And we can see that there are some overlaps, and some of the parts that I talked about last time with regard to courage and pride being some of Aristotle's important virtues. And he also, of course, Aristotle talked about justice and friendship as well. He talked about self-restraint and a number of things. And so it might be possible to say, okay, well, perhaps justice and self-restraint are also echoed in the slave morality. So it's not necessarily a clear overlap between these ideas. But it's definitely something that's worth exploring. I think that some of that master morality, some of the concepts of master morality are really missing in our society. And it seems like, to me and to, I'm sure, other people as well, I know I've seen this expressed here and there elsewhere, that the modern liberal ethical system is very similar to what Nietzsche describes as the slave moral code. And then the conservative is a little bit more like the master moral code. That's an argument that can be made, and I think there's some validity to that. Now, that could possibly rub some people the wrong way. Many modern conservatives are very Christian. Nietzsche is very anti-Christian, and he attributes much of the, as I said, much of the slave morality to a Christian morality, and that, to my mind, somewhat corresponds to the modern liberal. And so there's a sort of a disconnect here, and like Aristotle had talked about justice as being one component of a multitude of virtues, and in some ways you could say that the modern liberal has elevated justice to like the highest level of moral code, and also charity and things like that, which charity especially would correspond to the slave morality more so than justice, and charity even trumps justice many times in the modern liberal mindset. So these are all things that we can explore, because I'm kind of like looking around to see at some ideas of how Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory that we looked at back in The Righteous Mind a few episodes ago, and this kind of split between the moral system of the conservative and the moral system of the progressive, and how the progressive really focuses in on one particular aspect of morality, in particular the kindness, the charity, the compassion, the selflessness, the giving. That seems to be very, very important to the modern progressive. Obviously, that is manifested within certain parameters. It has concepts of the government oversight and the government control, the nanny state, as opposed to, say, a voluntary charity that would be more likely on the right. So again, these things don't align perfectly, but as Jonathan Haidt put forward, the sense of avoiding harm, making sure that you don't harm people, making sure that that the people who have the least are not overlooked. That's really fundamental to much of progressivism. And then the conservative has more balanced, where that's important, but things like liberty and freedom are also important, and things like fidelity to one's family or one's tribe, if you will, or more, the loyalty, the authority, giving proper deference to authority, and knowing where you fit within a hierarchy. These are things that are components of the conservative moral code that the modern progressive moral code doesn't really recognize, or even recognizes as not virtues at all, but as vices. And so there's this sort of singular focus on the care-harm dynamic among the progressives, and a more broad focus among the conservatives, and then that same thing sort of manifested in a way in Aristotle's broad approach to virtues, in that there's justice, and there's courage, and there's friendship, and there's self-restraint, and there's pride, and there's all these virtues. It's not just one, and none of them are taken to an extreme, but all these virtues are important. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with the last two books, and the framework within which I wanted to approach this one. So it looks like I've got 5 sections here that I want to read aloud to you. As always, I'm going to read some sections of the book out loud to you, so that you can really get a handle on what he's saying, and only particular sections, a few spots that I think are important. And then I'm going to discuss them a little bit, and we can kind of see, where we go from here, and what this book says, and how it relates to what we've looked at so far. So the first part I want to read is right from the very beginning. This is a little bit of a longer section. He talks about good and evil. Well, this is all from what's called the first essay. The second essay, I believe the second essay is the one that talks about punishment. And the first essay is called Good and Bad. The first essay is called Good and Evil, Good and Bad. And that's because he's drawing a conclusion he's drawing a contrast between the good and evil dichotomy and the good and bad dichotomy. And he essentially, I'm kind of giving you some of the framework ahead of time so that you have a bit of a context within which to hear and understand this. But he's basically saying that the good and evil dichotomy, is the dichotomy of the slave morality, and the good and bad dichotomy is the dichotomy of the master morality. And that good and bad is really could be more understood as maybe superior and inferior, or correct and incorrect, that sort of thing. It doesn't have the same connotations that good and evil have, which is more a connotation of kindness is good and cruelty is evil, and it's a different sort of dichotomy. And so that's the framework within which he's discussing this. So I'm going to jump right in here from the beginning and read the first couple of pages of this. It looks like it's about maybe 6-7 pages or something like that I want to read here. Something along those lines. Anyway, let's get right in and check this out. So he says, quote, "The English psychologists, to whom we owe the only attempts that have thus far been made to write a genealogy of morals, are no mean posers of riddles. But the riddles they pose are themselves, and being incarnate, have one advantage over their books. They are interesting." What are these English psychologists really after? One finds them always, whether intentionally or not, engaged in the same task of pushing into the foreground the nasty part of the psyche, looking for the effective motive forces of human development in the very last place we would wish to have them found. For example, in the inertia of habit, in forgetfulness, in the blind and fortuitous association of ideas, always in something that is purely passive, automatic, reflexive, molecular, and moreover, profoundly stupid. What drives these psychologists forever in the same direction? A secret, malicious desire to belittle humanity, which they do not even acknowledge to themselves? A pessimistic distrust, the suspiciousness of the soured idealist? Some petty resentment of Christianity and Plato, which does not rise above the threshold of consciousness? Or could it be a prurient taste for whatever is embarrassing, painfully paradoxical, dubious, and absurd in existence? Or is it, perhaps, a kind of stew? A little meanness, a little bitterness, a bit of anti-Christianity, a touch of prurience and desire for condiments? But again, people tell me that these men are simply dull old frogs who hop and creep in and around man as in their own element, as though man were a bog. However, I am reluctant to listen to this. In fact, I refuse to believe it. And if I may express a wish where I cannot express a conviction, I do wish wholeheartedly that things may be otherwise with these men. That these microscopic examiners of the soul may be really courageous, magnanimous, and proud animals, who know how to contain their emotions, and have trained themselves to subordinate all wishful thinking to the truth, any truth, even a homespun, severe, ugly, obnoxious, unchristian, unmoral truth, for such truths do exist. All honor to the beneficent spirits that may motivate these historians of ethics. One thing is certain, however, they have been quite deserted by the true spirit of history. They all, to a man, think unhistorically, as is the age-old custom among philosophers. The amateurishness of their procedure is made plain from the very beginning, when it is a question of explaining the provenance of the concept and judgment good. Originally, they decree, altruistic actions were praised and approved by their recipients, that is, by those to whom they were useful. Later on, the origin of that praise having been forgotten, such actions were felt to be good simply because it was the habit to commend them. We notice at once that this first derivation has all the earmarks of the English psychologist's work. Here are the key ideas of utility, forgetfulness, habit, and finally, error, seen as lying at the root of that value system which civilized man had hitherto regarded with pride as the prerogative of all men. This pride must now be humbled, these values devalued. Have the debunkers succeeded? Now, it is obvious to me, first of all, that their theory looks for the genesis of the concept good in the wrong place. The judgment good does not originate with those to whom the good has been done. Rather, it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, mighty, highly placed, and high-minded, who decreed themselves and their actions to be good, for example, belonging to the highest rank, in contradistinction to all that was base, low-minded, and plebeian. It was only this pathos of distance that authorized them to create values and name them. What was utility to them? The notion of utility seems singularly inept to account for such a quick jetting forth of supreme value judgments. Here we come face to face with the exact opposite of that lukewarmness which every scheming prudence, every utilitarian calculus presupposes. And not for a time only, for the rare exceptional hour, but permanently. The origin of the opposites, good and bad, is to be found in the pathos of nobility and distance, representing the dominant temper of a higher ruling class in relation to a lower dependent one. The lordly right of bestowing names is such that one would almost be justified in seeing the origin of language itself as an expression of the ruler's power. They say, this is that, or that. They seal off each thing and action with a sound, and thereby take symbolic possession of it. Such an origin would suggest that there is no a priori necessity for associating the word good with altruistic deeds, as those moral psychologists are fond of claiming. In fact, it is only after aristocratic values have begun to decline that the egotism-altruism dichotomy takes possession of the human conscience. To use my own terms, it is the herd instinct that now asserts itself. Yet it takes quite a while for this instinct to assume such sway that it can reduce all moral valuations to that dichotomy, as is currently happening throughout Europe, where the prejudice equating the terms moral, altruistic, and disinterested has assumed the obsessive force of an idée fixe. Quite apart from the fact that this hypothesis about the origin of the value judgment good is historically untenable, its psychology is intrinsically unsound. Altruistic deeds were originally commended for their usefulness, but this original reason has now been forgotten. So the claim goes. How is such forgetting conceivable? Has there ever been a point in history at which such deeds lost their usefulness? Quite the contrary. This usefulness has been apparent to every age, a thing that has been emphasized over and over again. Therefore, instead of being forgotten, it must have impressed itself on the consciousness with ever-increasing clearness. The opposite theory is far more sensible, though this does not necessarily make it any the truer. The theory held by Herbert Spencer, for example, who considers the concept good qualitatively the same as the concepts useful or practical, so that in the judgments good and bad, humanity is said to have summed up and sanctioned precisely its unforgotten and unforgettable experiences of the useful, practical, and the harmful, impractical. According to this theory, the good is that which all along has proved itself and which therefore may lay the highest claim to be considered valuable. As I have said, the derivation of this theory is suspect, but at least the explanation is self-consistent and psychologically tenable within its limits. The clue to the correct explanation was furnished me by the question, what does the etymology of the terms for good in various languages tell us? I discovered that all these terms lead us back to the same conceptual transformation. The basic concept is always noble in the hierarchical class sense, and from this has developed by historical necessity the concept good, embracing nobility of mind, spiritual distinction. This development is strictly parallel to that other which eventually converted the notions common, plebeian, base into the notion bad. Here we have an important clue to the actual genealogy of morals. That it has not been hit upon earlier is due to the retarding influence which democratic prejudice has had upon all investigation of origins. This holds equally true with regard to the seemingly quite objective areas of natural science and physiology, though I cannot enlarge upon the question now. The amount of damage such prejudice is capable of doing in ethics and history, once it becomes inflamed with hatred, is clearly shown by the case of Buckle. Here we see the plebeian bias of the modern mind, which stems from England, erupts once again on its native soil with all the violence of a muddy volcano and all the vulgar and oversalted eloquence characteristic of volcanoes. As for our own problem, which we may justly call a quiet one, addressing itself to a very restricted audience, it is of interest to note that many of the words and roots denominating good still to this day carry overtones of the meanings according to which the nobility regarded themselves as possessing the highest moral rank. It is true that, most often, they described themselves simply in terms of their superior power, as the rulers, lords, sovereigns, or else in terms of the visible signs of their superiority, as the rich, the possessors. This is the meaning of Arya, and there are corresponding terms in the Iranian and Slavic language, but also in terms of a typical character trait, and this is the case that concerns us here. They speak of themselves as the truthful. Most resolute in doing this were members of the Greek aristocracy, whose mouthpiece is the Megarian poet Theognis. The word they used was esthlos, meaning one who is, who has. The word they used was esthlos, meaning one who is, who has true reality, who is true. By a subjective turn, the true later became the truthful. During this phase, the word provided the shibboleth of the nobility, describing the aristocrat, as Theognis saw and portrayed him, in distinction from the lying plebeian, until finally, after the decline of the aristocracy, the word came to stand for spiritual nobility, and ripened and sweetened. The words kakos and dielos, the plebeian in contrast to the agathos, emphasize cowardice and provide a hint as to the direction in which we should look for the etymology of agathos, a word allowing of more than one interpretation. End quote. Okay, so that was obviously a fairly long section. He talks a little bit about the English philosophers. He's really talking about, say, utilitarians, and he I don't know exactly where he derives this idea that the according to the English philosophers, the concept of good was essentially that a good thing was, or an altruistic thing was done for someone, and the person who received the benefit of that considered it good because they benefited, and so those altruistic acts just became known as good, but it really derived from the position of the person who received the altruistic action. And he says that's absurd. The people who receive the good deed, the objects of the good deed, the recipients of the good deed, don't define what is good. The people who are good define themselves as good. It's not a notion that's given by someone else. and he talks about how the aristocracy defined themselves as good, as true. It really comes from the idea of truth, that the aristocrats believed themselves to have a more firm reality, and that became the concept of truthful in opposition to untruthful, and eventually became the idea of good. And so he does draw back to the Greeks in particular for that notion. So I'm going to move on here to read the next section. I'm only skipping over a short area here. He talks a little bit about some of the etymology, the particulars of the etymology of different languages of the word good. I'm not as interested in the particulars of that, but I'm going to jump ahead here to where he says the following. Quote, "Granting that political supremacy always gives rise to notions of spiritual supremacy, it at first creates no difficulties, though difficulties might arise later, if the ruling caste is also the priestly caste, and elects to characterize itself by a term which reminds us of its priestly function. In this context, we encounter for the first time concepts of pure and impure, opposing each other as signs of class, and here too, good and bad as terms no longer referring to class develop before long. The reader should be cautioned, however, against taking pure and impure in too large or profound or symbolic a sense. All the ideas of ancient man were understood in a sense much more crude, narrow, superficial, and non-symbolic than we are able to imagine today. The pure man was originally one who washed himself, who refused to eat certain foods entailing skin diseases, who did not sleep with the unwashed plebeian women, who held blood in abomination, hardly more than that. At the same time, given the peculiar nature of a priestly aristocracy, it becomes clear why the value opposites would early turn inward and become dangerously exacerbated. And in fact, the tension between such opposites has opened abysses between man and man, over which not even an Achilles of free thought would leap without a shudder. There is from the very start something unwholesome about such priestly aristocracies, about their way of life, which is turned away from action and swings between brooding and emotional explosions. A way of life which may be seen as responsible for the morbidity and neurasthenia of priests of all periods. Yet, are we not right in maintaining that the cures which they have developed for their morbidities have proved 100 times more dangerous than the ills themselves? Humanity is still suffering from the after effects of these priestly cures. Think, for example, of certain forms of diet, abstinence from meat, fasting, sexual continence, escape into the desert. Think further of the whole anti-sensual metaphysics of the priests, conducive to inertia and false refinement, of the self-hypnosis encouraged by the example of fakirs and Brahmins, where a glass knob and an idée fixe take the place of the god. And at last, supervening on all this, comes utter satiety, together with its radical remedy, nothingness. Or God, for the desire for a mystical union with God is nothing other than the Buddhist's desire to sink himself in nirvana. Among the priests, everything becomes more dangerous. Not cures and specifics alone, but also arrogance, vindictiveness, acumen, profligacy, love, the desire for power, disease. In all fairness, it should be added, however, that only on this soil, the precarious soil of priestly existence, has man been able to develop into an interesting creature. That only here has the human mind grown, both profound and evil, and it is in these two respects, after all, that man has proved his superiority over the rest of creation. By now, the reader will have got some notion of how readily the priestly system of valuations can branch off from the aristocratic and develop into its opposite. An occasion for such division is furnished whenever the priest caste and the warrior caste jealously clash with one another and find themselves unable to come to terms. The chivalrous and aristocratic valuations presuppose a strong physique, blooming, even exuberant health, together with all the conditions that guarantee its preservation: combat, adventure, the chase, the dance, war games, etc. The value system of the priestly aristocracy is founded on different presuppositions. So much the worse for them when it becomes a question of war. As we all know, priests are the most evil enemies to have. Why should this be so? Because they are the most impotent. It is their impotence which makes their hate so violent and sinister, so cerebral and poisonous. The greatest haters in history, but also the most intelligent haters, have been priests. Beside the brilliance of priestly vengeance, all other brilliance fades. Human history would be a dull and stupid thing without the intelligence furnished by its impotence. End quote. Okay, so not quite so long in that section, but you are looking at this idea of starting with political supremacy. He says in the very beginning, granting that political supremacy always gives rise to notions of spiritual supremacy, it at first creates no difficulties if the ruling caste is also the priestly caste. So you have a situation where you start off with political power, and you, because of your political superiority, you assume to yourself a corresponding spiritual superiority. And that sense of spiritual superiority creates the priestly class, and the priestly class and the ruling warrior class are the same people. And over time, that divides. It creates a separate set of values. And he says, given the peculiar nature of a priestly aristocracy, it becomes clear why the value opposites would early turn inward and become dangerously exacerbated. And so instead of the supremacy or the goodness or the power of this priestly class coming from vigorous action, which is what put it into that position in the first place, it becomes contemplative. And the ruling class no longer necessarily has to strive to maintain its power. It becomes inward, and it becomes a softer sense of superiority. And what he says here, he says there's something from the very start, something unwholesome about such priestly aristocracies, about their way of life, which is turned away from action and swings between brooding and emotional explosions, a way of life which may be seen as responsible for the morbidity and neurasthenia of priests of all periods. And so this inwardness, this brooding, contemplative sense of spiritual superiority, as opposed to the active, vigorous superiority that is the purview of the political rulership class, the aristocracy, they begin to clash against one another and can create the division and separation of a priestly and an aristocratic class. And he talks about the weakness in such time of war or conflict, the weakness of the priestly class. And so from that branching off of those who tend more toward the brooding, contemplative, and those who tend more toward the vigorous, physical, as the rulership class kind of splits in along these lines, the priestly class is weaker. It has a sense of impotence, and yet believes itself to be of a spiritual superiority. And yet that spiritual superiority is not manifested because the aristocratic class is able to overpower. They don't have the same capacity. It becomes, he says, as we all know, priests are the most evil enemy to have because they are the most impotent. It is their impotence which makes their hate so violent and sinister, so cerebral and poisonous. He says, human history would be a dull and stupid thing without the intelligence furnished by its impotence. And then he goes on from there, and he begins to bring forward the idea of Judaism as a source of this sort of priestly impotence and this priestly resentment. And he talks a lot in this about Judaism and Christianity. He focuses a little bit more in the early parts here about Jewishness, but much of what he's describing sounds, as he describes it, sounds more Christian to me. And maybe it's just my own perspective here, but as he unfolds some of the ideas of the slave morality, it paints a picture of much of Christian morality to my eye, more so than a Jewish morality, because they're not necessarily the same. But I don't want to get real deep into that. That's not necessarily what I want to spend a lot of time talking about at this time. I want to move on a little bit to this section where he says, quote, "The slave revolt in morals begins by rancor turning creative and giving birth to values. The rancor of beings who, deprived of the direct outlet of action, compensate by an imaginary vengeance. All truly noble morality grows out of triumphant self-affirmation. Slave ethics, on the other hand, begins by saying no to an outsider, an other, a non-self, and that no is its creative act. This reversal of direction, of the evaluating look, this invariable looking outward instead of inward, is a fundamental feature of rancor. Slave ethics requires for its inception a sphere different from and hostile to its own. Physiologically speaking, it requires an outside stimulus in order to act at all. All its action is reaction. The opposite is true of aristocratic valuations. Such values grow and act spontaneously, seeking out their contraries only in order to affirm themselves even more gratefully and delightedly. Here, the negative concepts, humble, base, bad, are late, pallid counterparts of the positive, intense, and passionate credo, we noble, good, beautiful, happy ones. Aristocratic valuations may go amiss and do violence to reality, but this happens only with regard to spheres which they do not know well, or from the knowledge of which they austerely guard themselves. The aristocrat will, on occasion, misjudge a sphere which he holds in contempt, the sphere of the common man, the people. On the other hand, we should remember that the emotion of contempt, of looking down, provided that it falsifies at all, is as nothing compared with the falsification which suppressed hatred, impotent vindictiveness, effects upon its opponent, though only in effigy. There is, in all contempt, too much casualness and nonchalance, too much blinking of facts and impatience, and too much inborn gaiety for it to ever make of its object a downright caricature and monster. Here the almost benevolent nuances of the Greek aristocracy, for example, puts into all its terms for the commoner. How emotions of compassion, consideration, indulgence sugarcoat these words until, in the end, almost all terms referring to the common man survive as expressions for unhappy, pitiable. For example, Dielos, Diolios, Poneros, Moktheros, the last two of which properly characterize the common man as a drudge and beast of burden. How, on the other hand, the words bad, base, unhappy have continued to strike a similar note for the Greek ear, with the timbre unhappy preponderating. The well-born really felt that they were also the happy. They did not have to construct their happiness factitiously by looking at their enemies, as all rancorous men are wont to do, and being fully active, energetic people, they were incapable of divorcing happiness from action. They accounted activity a necessary part of happiness, which explains the origin of the phrase eupratein. All this stands in utter contrast to what is called happiness among the impotent and oppressed, who are full of bottled-up aggressions. Their happiness is purely passive and takes the form of drugged tranquility, stretching and yawning, peace, Sabbath, emotional slackness. Whereas the noble lives before his own conscience with confidence and frankness. Genaios, nobly bred, emphasizes the nuance truthful and perhaps also ingenuous. The rancorous person is neither truthful nor ingenuous, nor honest and forthright with himself. His soul squints. His mind loves hideouts, secret paths, and back doors. Everything that is hidden seems to him his own world, his security, his comfort. He is expert in silence, in long memory, in waiting, in provisional self-depreciation, and in self-humiliation. A race of such men will, in the end, inevitably be cleverer than a race of aristocrats, and it will honor sharp-wittedness to a much greater degree, i.e., as an absolutely vital condition for its existence. Among the noble, mental acuteness always tends slightly to suggest luxury and over-refinement. The fact is that with them it is much less important than is the perfect functioning of the ruling unconscious instincts, or even a certain temerity to follow sudden impulses, court danger, or indulge spurts of violent rage, love, worship, gratitude, or vengeance. When a noble man feels resentment, it is absorbed in his instantaneous reaction, and therefore does not poison him. Moreover, in countless cases where we might expect it, it never arises. While with weak and impotent people, it occurs without fail. It is a sign of strong, rich temperaments that they cannot for long take seriously their enemies, their misfortunes, their misdeeds, for such characters have in them an excess of plastic curative power and also a power of oblivion. A good modern example of the latter is Mirabeau, who lacked all memory for insults and meannesses done him, and who was unable to forgive because he had forgotten. Such a man simply shakes off vermin, which would get beneath another's skin. And only here, if anywhere on earth, is it possible to speak of loving one's enemy. The noble person will respect his enemy, and respect is already a bridge to love. Indeed, he requires his enemy for himself, as his mark of distinction, nor could he tolerate any other enemy than one in whom he finds nothing to despise and much to esteem. Imagine, on the other hand, the enemy as conceived by the rancorous man, for this is his true creative achievement. He has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, as a fundamental idea, and then, as a pendant, he has conceived a good one, himself. The exact opposite is true of the noble-minded, who spontaneously creates the notion good, and later derives from it the conception of the bad. How ill-matched these two concepts look, placed side by side. The bad of noble origin and the evil that has risen out of the cauldron of unquenched hatred. The first is a byproduct, a complementary color, almost an afterthought. The second is the beginning, the original creative act of slave ethics. But neither is the conception of good the same in both cases, as we soon find out when we ask ourselves who it is that is really evil according to the code of rancor. The answer is precisely the good one of the opposite code, that is, the noble, the powerful, only colored, reinterpreted, re-envisaged by the poisonous eye of resentment. And we are the first to admit that anyone who knew these good ones as enemies would find them evil enemies indeed, for these same men who, among themselves, are so strictly constrained by custom, worship, ritual, gratitude, and by mutual surveillance and jealousy, who are so resourceful in consideration, tenderness, loyalty, pride, and friendship, when once they step outside their circle, become little better than uncaged beasts of prey. Once abroad in the wilderness, they revel in the freedom from social constraint and compensate for their long confinement in the quietude of their own community. They revert to the innocence of wild animals. We can imagine them returning from an orgy of murder, arson, rape, and torture, jubilant and at peace with themselves as though they had committed a fraternity prank, convinced, moreover, that the poets, for a long time to come, will have something to sing about and to praise. Deep within all these noble races there lurks the beast of prey, bent on spoil and conquest. This hidden urge has to be satisfied from time to time, the beast let loose in the wilderness. This goes as well for the Roman, Arabian, German, Japanese nobility, as for the Homeric heroes and the Scandinavian Vikings. The noble races have everywhere left in their wake the catchword barbarian. And even their highest culture shows an awareness of the trait and a certain pride in it. As we see, for example, in Pericles' famous funeral oration, when he tells the Athenians, "Our boldness has gained us access to every land and sea and erected monuments to itself for both good and evil." This boldness of noble races, so headstrong, absurd, incalculable, sudden, improbable. Pericles commends the Athenians especially for their rathumia, their utter indifference to safety and comfort, their terrible pleasure in destruction, their taste for cruelty. All these traits are embodied by their victims in the image of the barbarian, the evil enemy, the Goth or the Vandal. The profound and icy suspicion which the German arouses as soon as he assumes power, we see it happening again today, harks back to the persistent horror with which Europe for many centuries witnessed the raging of the blonde Teutonic beast, although all racial connection between the old Teutonic tribes and ourselves has been lost. I once drew attention to the embarrassment Hesiod must have felt when he tried to embody the cultural epics of mankind in the gold, silver, and iron ages. He could cope with the contradictions inherent in Homer's world, so marvelous on the one hand, so ghastly and brutal on the other, only by making two ages out of one, and presenting them in temporal sequence. First, the age of the heroes and demigods, of Troy and Thebes, as that world was still remembered by the noble tribes who traced their ancestry to it, and second, the Iron Age, which presented the same world as seen by the descendants of those who had been crushed, despoiled, brutalized, sold into slavery. If it were true, as passes current nowadays, that the real meaning of culture resides in its power to domesticate man's savage instincts, then we might be justified in viewing all those rancorous machinations by which the noble tribes and their ideals have been laid low as the true instruments of culture. But this would still not amount to saying that the organizers themselves represent culture. Rather, the exact opposite would be true, as is vividly shown by the current state of affairs. These carriers of the leveling and retributive instincts, these descendants of every European and extra-European slavedom, and especially of the pre-Aryan populations, represent human retrogression most flagrantly. Such instruments of culture are a disgrace to man and might make one suspicious of culture altogether. End quote. So what he's essentially saying here is that the master morality, or the noble state of mind, begins by proclaiming itself good, and then as an afterthought proclaims other things which don't represent those same characters, those same character traits, as bad. And there's a sort of pity or nonchalance, he says, in how the noble approaches the bad. He says such a man simply shakes off vermin which would get beneath another's skin. And so there's not a real concern for the bad. It's really all about the definitions of the good. Whereas with the slave morality, or the rancorous, resentful morality, the whole system is built around the other, the enemy. First, the enemy is defined as evil, and then afterward, the self is defined as good by not being the evil. It's only the goodness of the slave morality is only defined. It only exists in opposition to the primacy of the evil one. That is its core. He says, imagine, on the other hand, the enemy as conceived by the rancorous man, for this is his true creative achievement. He has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, as a fundamental idea, and then as a pendant, he has conceived a good one himself. So the slave morality is based first on the defining of the master morality as evil. And he says, look at we've got the difference between the concept of evil and bad, but also look at the difference between the sense of good, because what is good in the master morality is defined as evil in the slave morality. And that is because they're viewed from the position of the people who have been brutalized by those of the master morality, is essentially what he's saying in that section. So now, we really start to get into the definitions of what the difference is between these two different concepts. And then, moving on to the next section, he says, quote, "There is nothing very odd about lambs disliking birds of prey, but this is no reason for holding it against large birds of prey that carry off lambs. And when the lambs whisper among themselves, 'These birds of prey are evil,' and does not this give us a right to say that whatever is the opposite of a bird of prey must be good? There is nothing intrinsically wrong with such an argument, though the birds of prey will look somewhat quizzically and say, 'We have nothing against these good lambs. In fact, we love them. Nothing tastes better than a tender lamb.' To expect that strength will not manifest itself as strength, as the desire to overcome, to appropriate, to have enemies, obstacles, and triumphs, is every bit as absurd as to expect that weakness will manifest itself as strength. A quantum of strength is equivalent to a quantum of urge, will, activity, and it is only the snare of language, of the arch fallacies of reason petrified in language, presenting all activity as conditioned by an agent, the subject, that blinds us to this fact. For just as popular superstition divorces the lightning from its brilliance, viewing the latter as an activity whose subject is the lightning, so does popular morality divorce strength from its manifestations, as though there were behind the strong a neutral agent free to manifest its strength or contain it. But no such agent exists. There is no being behind the doing, acting, becoming. The doer has simply been added to the deed by the imagination. The doing is everything. The common man actually doubles the doing by making the lightning flash. He states the same event once as cause and then again as effect. The natural scientists are no better when they say that energy moves, energy causes. For all its detachment and freedom from emotion, our science is still the dupe of linguistic habits. it has never yet got rid of those changelings called subjects. The atom is one such changeling. Another is the Kantian thing in itself. Small wonder, then, that the repressed and smoldering emotions of vengeance and hatred have taken advantage of this superstition, and in fact espouse no belief more ardently than that it is within the discretion of the strong to be weak, of the bird of prey to be a lamb. Thus they assume the right of calling the bird of prey to account for being a bird of prey. We can hear the oppressed, downtrodden, violated, whispering among themselves with the wily vengefulness of the impotent, "Let us be unlike these evil ones. Let us be good. And the good shall be he who does not do violence, does not attack or retaliate, who leaves vengeance to God, who, like us, lives hidden, who shuns all that is evil, and altogether asks very little of life, like us, the patient, the humble, the just ones." Read in cold blood, this means nothing more than, we weak ones are in fact weak. It is a good thing that we do nothing for which we are not strong enough. But this plain fact, this basic prudence, which even the insects have, who, in circumstances of great danger, sham death in order to not have to do too much, has tricked itself out in the garb of quiet, virtuous resignation, thanks to the duplicity of impotence, as though the weakness of the weak, which is, after all, his essence, his natural way of being, his sole and inevitable reality, were a spontaneous act, a meritorious deed. This sort of person requires the belief in a free subject able to choose indifferently out of that instinct of self-preservation which notoriously justifies every kind of lie. It may well be that to this day the subject, or in popular language the soul, has been the most viable of all articles of faith, simply because it makes possible for the majority of mankind, i.e. the weak and oppressed of every sort, to practice the sublime state of hand which gives weakness the appearance of free choice, and one's natural disposition the distinction of merit. End quote. So in that section he opens it up by talking about the lambs and the birds of prey, and that it is in the nature of the bird of prey to be a bird of prey. It's in the nature of the weak to be weak. They're defined by their weakness or their strength or what have you, and postulates some sort of agent behind this, that a bird of prey has a soul that chooses to be a bird of prey, and a weak lamb has a soul that chooses to be weak, rather than this strength and weakness being inherent to creatures and to beings. So that's kind of the postulation of the soul or the impartial agent, choosing agent, the source of the free will to act, to choose, to be this way or that way, rather than simply the expression of one's inherent nature. And so that's a kind of an interesting idea that is postulated there. And such, he talks about the weak congratulating themselves on their weakness in order to create a new system of values that elevates themselves, and that's derived from resentment. And so, moving on from there, I'm going to go to the last section that I wanted to read. And this section is not all that long either, but this should kind of, bring everything together. So he says in this section, quote, "The two sets of valuations, good/bad and good/evil, have waged a terrible battle on this earth, lasting many millennia. And just as surely as the second set has for a long time now been in the ascendant, so surely are there still places where the battle goes on and the issue remains in suspension. It might even be claimed that by being raised to a higher plane, the battle has become much more profound. Perhaps there is today not a single intellectual worth his salt who is not divided on that issue, a battleground for those opposites. The watchwords of the battle, written in characters which have remained legible throughout human history, read, Rome versus Israel, Israel versus Rome. No battle has ever been more momentous than this one. Rome viewed Israel as a monstrosity. The Romans regarded the Jews as convicted of hatred against the whole of mankind. And rightly so, if one is justified in associating the welfare of the human species with absolute supremacy of aristocratic values. But how did the Jews, on their part, feel about Rome? 1,000 indications point to the answer. It is enough to read once more the Revelations of St. John, the most rabid outburst of vindictiveness in all recorded history. We ought to acknowledge the profound consistency of the Christian instinct in assigning this book of hatred and the most extravagantly doting of the Gospels to the same disciple. There is a piece of truth hidden here, no matter how much literary skullduggery may have gone on. The Romans were the strongest and most noble people who ever lived. Every vestige of them, every least inscription is a sheer delight, provided we are able to read the spirit behind the writing. The Jews, on the contrary, were the priestly, rancorous nation par excellence. Though possessed of an unequaled ethical genius, we need only compare with them nations of comparable endowments, such as the Chinese or the Germans, to sense which occupies the first rank. Has the victory so far been gained by the Romans or by the Jews? But this is really an idle question. Remember who it is before whom one bows down in Rome itself, as before the essence of all supreme values, and not only in Rome, but over half the globe, wherever man has grown tame or desires to grow tame. Before 3 Jews and 1 Jewess, Jesus of Nazareth, the fisherman Peter, the rug weaver Paul, and Maria, the mother of that Jesus. This is very curious. Rome, without a doubt, has capitulated. It is true that during the Renaissance, men witnessed a strange and splendid awakening of the classical ideal. Like one buried alive, Rome stirred under the weight of a new Judaic Rome that looked like an ecumenical synagogue and was called the Church. But presently Israel triumphed once again thanks to the plebeian rancor of the German and English Reformation, together with its natural corollary, the restoration of the Church, which also meant the restoration of ancient Rome to the quiet of the tomb. In an even more decisive sense did Israel triumph over the classical ideal through the French Revolution. For then, the last political nobleness Europe had known, that of 17th and 18th century France, collapsed under the weight of vindictive popular instincts. A wilder enthusiasm was never seen. And yet, in the midst of it all, something tremendous, something wholly unexpected happened. The ancient classical ideal appeared incarnate and in unprecedented splendor before the eyes and conscience of mankind. Once again, stronger, simpler, more insistent than ever, over against the lying shibboleth of the rights of the majority, against the furious tendency toward leveling out and debasement, sounded the terrible yet exhilarating shibboleth of the prerogative of the few. Like a last signpost to an alternative route, Napoleon appeared, most isolated and anachronistic of men, the embodiment of the noble ideal. It might be well to ponder what exactly Napoleon, that synthesis of the brutish with the more than human, did represent. Was it all over then? Had the greatest conflict of ideals been shelved for good, or had it only been indefinitely adjourned? Might not these smoldering fires start up again one day, all the more terrible because longer and more secretly nourished? Moreover, should we not wish for this event with all our hearts, and even help to promote it? If the reader, at this point, begins to develop his own train of thought, he is not likely to soon come to the end of it. All the more reason why I should conclude, assuming that I have made sufficiently clear what I mean by the dangerous slogan on the title page of my last book, Beyond Good and Evil. At all events, I do not mean beyond good and bad. End quote. So that will close us out for the sections that we wanted to read. Let me just kind of reiterate what we see in this last section here. He kind of boils it down and postulates it as a conflict between Rome and Israel. Israel being the source of resentment, and Rome being the source of hierarchy and aristocracy. So the sense of resentment creates is a leveling influence, because any difference, any inequality, or any raising of one person above another creates this sense of resentment and fosters this sense of resentment, as in the slave morality that must then be flattened. In a society of perfect equals is the only society in which there is no room left for resentment. And so the good and evil framework is built on resentment, and the good and bad framework is built on superiority and inferiority, or correctness and incorrectness, nobility and debasement. It's a separate, different moral system that he attributes to Rome, and by that specifically he means ancient Rome, not Christian Rome, ancient pagan Rome. And he looks back to the ancient pagan Greeks. And so much of the notion of good and bad and master morality is explicitly tied back to ancient pagan value systems. And the good and evil moral code and dichotomy is tied into Judaism and tied into Christianity. And he basically says Rome has completely capitulated by becoming the center of Christianity rather than the center of the hierarchical pagan world that it once represented. And he brings up Napoleon as one last resurgence of the concept of the powerful ruler and the nobility and the aristocratic values. So I think that's all very interesting to my mind and my own sort of understanding of conservative and progressive. I see in the master morality a closer tie with some of the roots of conservatism as I understand it, and I see in this slave morality some of the roots of progressivism as I see it. And I think that Christianity and progressivism are much more closely bound, that a progressive and even like modern liberalism could only have been born in a predominantly Christian world. And it's everything is a little bit backwards nowadays, when most pagans are so deeply imbued with this slave morality, and their whole moral code is based on the elimination of all inequality. There's just so much leftist paganism that seems to me doesn't represent in any way the actual moral codes of the pre-Christian pagans. It's Christian morals with in a pagan costume much of the time. So I think I'm going to essentially wrap it up there. Where we'll go from here, I do think we have some interesting places to continue this conversation as we sort of look at some interpretations of modernity and some interpretations of ancient pre-Christian paganism, and we can kind of see how the master and slave morality manifests. The master and slave morality is an idea that I'm going to continue to work with in some upcoming books. So I guess that the concepts that I wanted to introduce in this episode have been adequately introduced, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up at this point. Thank you for listening very much. I hope you tune in next time, and I guess that should do it for now. Talk to you next time.